When Craig phoned me a few months ago and invited me to come to the Spokane Valley and tell stories, I went, oh, yeah, that sounds like fun. I'd like to do that. Great. And then I started to think about it, and a few days later I had to contact Craig and say, Craig, where the heck is Passmore? So I thought about that for a little while, and I realized, because a lot of you folks are from this valley, and I'm from another valley a little farther away, that I might need to give you a little bit of a geography quiz before we start here today. So we're all working on the same page with this story. So can I see you nod your head or something if you know where Ainsworth is? Okay, this is good. So if you know where Ainsworth is, I bet you're familiar with the communities of Proctor and Balfour, and in Balfour where you get the ferry boat. Okay. Kootenai Bay is at the other end of the ferry boat ride. You probably know that. Okay, now here's a harder one. Who knows where Kuskonook is? Okay. Kuskonook is almost at the very far end of Kootenai Lake. There used to be an old railway station there before the slide this winter. Now, one place that you might not know, and it's an important place to this story, and you might not know because it's not there anymore, is what about Pilot Bay? Oh, hey, we have a room full of history fans. So for those of you who might not know, when you're riding on that Kootenai Lake ferry heading from west to east, as you near Kootenai Bay, Pilot Bay would be about 1.5 miles south of Kootenai Bay, right near where you can see the big lighthouse on the hill. And you used to be able to see 2 tall red brick chimneys that are unfortunately being torn down right now. Okay, so now that we're all on the same page, I am going to tell you a story called Shipwreck on Kootenai Lake. And this story begins in the town of Ainsworth in the year 1891, where a bunch of local businessmen are standing around and they're feeling pretty darn smug. Because for the last year or so, Ainsworth has been the hottest little town on the shores of Kootenai Lake. Why, here they are standing right on the new boat dock. And it seems like several times a week now, one of Kootenai Lake's little stern wheelers pulls into town, and almost every boat has a miner or a mining speculator on it. And these guys, they're pretty happy because they can see Ainsworth Hot Springs getting just bigger and bigger and more prosperous. But in the fall of 1891, something happened to change all that. Rich mineral discoveries were made in the mountains north and west of Passmore, and all of a sudden whole boatloads full of miners were heading north on Kootenai Lake, but they weren't stopping at Ainsworth. These miners were in a big hurry to get there. They wanted like the express service. And all of a sudden, passengers found themselves standing on the dock in Ainsworth waiting for the boat, and the boats were passing them right by. And sometimes freight destined for Ainsworth was being put off in the freight shed in Balfour, and people were having to row down in their own boats to pick up the merchandise they'd already paid for. And that winter, it got even worse. Because the winter of 1891 was one of the coldest that had been experienced. And the west arm, most of the west arm of Kootenai Lake between Balfour and Nelson froze solid. So the boats couldn't even get out of Nelson. And all of a sudden, everything coming into Ainsworth had to be brought in by pack train. And prices soared. And as the long, hard, cold winters went on and on, supplies of whiskey dried up at the local bar. Now, the Ainsworth Hot Springs Springs newspaper called that a calamity. But the people of Ainsworth Hot Springs were a hard-working and resourceful bunch of people. And they put their heads together and they decided they would solve their own problems. They would build their own boat. So a guy named John Bremer, who ran the local livery stable, and another man who had a lumber yard, they were the first two in on the partnership, and pretty soon a bunch of other fellows had thrown money on the table, and later on that week, a couple of big wagon loads of lumber had been dumped on the rocky foreshore, and overnight, scores of unemployed miners had become boat builders. And the work went on all winter. And so, by the 4th of May in 1892, all was in readiness for the launching of Kootenai Lake's newest paddle wheel, the 84-foot-long SS City of Ainsworth. And oh, what a day it was for Ainsworth. There was a large crowd of people gathered. The blocks had been knocked out from under the hull of the boat. The wooden waves had been judiciously greased, and small boys had been hired to stop the town's stray dogs from licking up all the lubricant. Every team of horses from throughout the area was there at the capstans. There was a brass band. Well, parts of a brass band. And it should have been the most wonderful day for the town. But during the launch, a critical rope broke. And instead of the city of Ainsworth just sliding gracefully down and hitting the water, she came down the waves crooked. She came down kind of on her starboard side and then kind of on her port side. She hit the lake very hard and actually became wedged against the ledge of rock on the bottom of the lake. And she had to be pulled into deeper water by another boat. It wasn't a good start. And within a few months, it seemed like this little boat that carried the hopes and dreams of a whole community was going to be a bit of a disappointment. In her first year, she went through 3 captains. They didn't like her. They said she was cranky, which meant she was hard to steer. Now, some people blamed her builders. They said they had made her too broad for her length. And other people blamed her boilers. They said the boat was actually underpowered. And still other people, yet, just went, well, what do you expect when a bunch of miners think they'll have a go at shipbuilding? So the city of Ainsworth was licensed to be both a freight and passenger boat on Kootenai Lake. But even when she was brand new, she was not the finest nor the fastest boat on Kootenai Lake. And as competition grew for transportation around the lake, she very soon became more of a freight boat. You know, she never was like a sleek racehorse. She was more like a slow-moving, plodding workhorse. And she worked in what they called the jobbing trade. And that meant that mostly she pushed a lot of barges and she hauled a lot of ore. And she actually changed hands on almost an annual basis as her subsequent owners tried to make this little boat pay for herself. Now, the SS City of Ainsworth sank to the bottom of Kootenai Lake for the first time in July of 1897. Well, technically, her owners were really quick to point out that technically she didn't actually sink. She had to be run aground in Passmore Bay because she was sinking at the time. And if the west shore of the lake had been any further away that day, we'd have lost her then. But you know, there weren't very many regulations back then, so she was pumped out, she was loaded, she was cleaned up, and she just went back to work without so much as any kind of investigation at all. There was room open top. But hey, that was only a road. So as that century grew to a close, the economy around Kootenay Lake began to crash. The mineral market in the whole northwest corner of the continent actually began to crash. And all of a sudden there were more boats working on Kootenay Lake than there was work for them. And in the fall of 1898, the city of Ainsworth, which by then looked kind of dirty and dilapidated, was tied up early that fall at Pilot Bay for the winter. And lots of people around Kootenay Lake were pretty sure that boat would never work again. But in November, something happened to change all that. Another boat that was owned by the same company, the International, broke her drive shaft. That was a pretty common occurrence back then. And so the company contracted the city of Ainsworth and a captain named Alan Lean to take on the International's run. And the International used to leave Nelson in the late afternoon, and she would go up the West Arm past Balfour and Proctor. She would cross Kootenay Lake and stop at Pilot Bay, which was an important jumping off place for all the boat service south and north on Kootenay Lake. The boat would then proceed to Kuskanook at the south end of the lake, which was a railhead. And then the boat would go all the way up the Kootenay River, another 50 miles across the American border to Bonner's Ferry. So Alan Lane took the city of Ainsworth from Pilot Bay to Nelson to the shipyards to have a little bit of work done on her before she started doing this contract. And while the boat was in the shipyards, Captain Lean was busy. He was going in and out of all the waterfront hotels in Nelson, trying to round himself up a scratch crew to work on the boat. And hey, these things took time. And so it was when the city of Ainsworth left Nelson on that day, which was Tuesday, the 29th of November, 1892, it had been 10 days since people on the south end of Kootenay Lake had had boat service. And Captain Lean was more than anxious to get going. So the boat stopped twice in the West Arm to pick up cordwood fuel for the boilers. And they ended up actually taking on 7 cords of wood, which was more than the boat would usually carry. But Captain Lean hadn't worked on the lake for some time either, and he was uncertain about the wood supply further south on the lake. So he really loaded up. And because there was more wood than would all fit down beside the boilers and the firebox, there was about 5 cords of this wood had been stacked crossways across the bow of the boat. And when the boat moved out of the West Arm into the main part of Kootenay Lake at Balfour, they discovered that there was a really awful storm blowing from the south. And in order to get to Pilot Bay, which is almost directly opposite, they would have to travel right across the path of this storm. Now, the fellow who was working downstairs, the fireman, the guy who put the wood in the boiler, try as he might. Every trick he knew in the book, but nothing worked, and he just couldn't coax decent pressure out of the boat's boilers. And so, instead of the city of Ainsworth riding gracefully over the backs of the waves, she bounced and rooted her way through the waves for the whole 3-mile crossing. It was very uncomfortable. There was crockery breaking in the kitchen, and the passengers were getting banged about in the upper salon. Her canvas-painted decks were awash with water, and several times the spray from the waves was hitting the wheelhouse windows, and they were 17 feet above the water. It was a very slow very rough crossing. And it was with some relief that the boat pulled into Pilot Bay, which, because of its location, was completely protected from the storm. There was barely a breeze blowing in Pilot Bay. Now, as soon as the boat was pulled up in Pilot Bay, something pretty unusual happened. A man named Joe Davis, who was the oldest man, like the veteran on Alan Lane's crew, a man who had worked on the Atlantic Ocean, and a man who had worked on Kootenai Lake for many years, he went and talked to the captain, and he implored him to tie up the boat for the night and stay in Pilot Bay. He said he didn't like the feel of the boat, and he didn't like the look of the night. And the captain just brushed him off. He offered to double Joe's wages if he'd stay on the crew, and Joe said no. And he walked off the boat. And he wasn't the only one to leave. The young man who'd been working as the fireman, John Brett, he left too. He usually worked on the International, which was a much nicer boat. And he didn't want to ruin his reputation as one of Kootenai Lake's best firemen. He wasn't going to let this little boat do that. And the passengers were watching this. They watched these two men walk off the boat, and at the end of the dock, they parted ways because Joe Davis was a family man, and he lived in Pilot Bay, so he just went home to bed. John Brett was a bachelor, and he went off to the wedding party going on at Clark's Hotel. The same wedding Captain Lean was trying to keep his crew away from. Now, Captain Lean went to the wedding himself, but just long enough to hire one more crewman. He needed to have a crew of 8 to be legal. And he talked a young man named Jim McNeil into coming with him. Jim was actually one of the guys playing fiddle for the wedding, but he had another engagement to play at a wedding in Cuspanook the following night. So Jim thought himself ever so lucky to have got this bit of work, and he packed up his fiddle really quickly, and he accompanied the captain back to the boat. Now, despite everyone on the boat seeing what had just happened, nobody got off the boat in Pilot Bay except 2 crewmen. And at 6:30 that night, right on time, the steam whistle blew. The city of Ainsworth backed away from the dock. She steamed across the bay, and she disappeared around the corner, right into the teeth of what people later said was a fierce winter gale. Now, those who survived the disaster said that the little boat struggled from the very moment she left Pilot Bay, because Jim McNeil wasn't doing any better down at the boilers than the other fellow had, and the boat was sorely underpowered. And now, of course, she was heading directly into the storm. For about the first hour, the boat slowly fought her way along the coastline of Pilot Peninsula. And when she got to Cape Horn, which is the south end of the peninsula, just across from the Grey Creek store, the pilot Captain Lane actually turned the boat on a course more toward the center of the lake. And he did this in order to reduce the length of the 27-mile journey that he had yet to make to get to Cuspanook. And so it was at about 8 o'clock at night, at a location a few miles further south of there, where Rhinoceros Point is on the west side of Kootenai Lake, and Lockhart Creek Park is on the east side of Kootenai Lake. The SS City of Ainsworth was in the middle of Kootenai Lake, in one of the widest parts of the lake, and incidentally one of the deepest parts of Kootenai Lake, when she was hit by the full force of the storm. Already, Captain Lane had another man in the wheelhouse with him, just helping him hold the wheel to keep the bow into the wind. And the boat was really not making any forward motion at all. And when it seemed like things couldn't possibly get worse, a crewman ran upstairs and told the captain that water was rising in the boat's hold. The captain ordered the extra cordwood thrown off the bow. But what this did was make the water that was already inside her hull flow toward the back of the boat. This put the giant paddle wheel even deeper into the water and made the boat completely unresponsive to the wheel. Apparently, the vessel shuddered sickeningly and rolled first to starboard, then to port, and then just rolled over onto her starboard side. Now you might like to close your eyes for a couple of minutes, because for one thing, at 8 o'clock at night during a storm in late November, it's pitch dark outside. And any lights aboard the boat would have gone out when she rolled over. Lamps poured empty of their fuel, fragile chimneys broken. And because of this, survivors primarily remembered the sounds and the smells of the disaster, and they were terrifying enough. Because one of the first things that happened, of course, was that the icy cold water of Kootenai Lake met with the red-hot boilers down in the bottom of the boat. And it was like cauldrons of steam bubbling up from below the wreck, making the most horrible gurgling and hissing sounds. And there were other sounds, too. There was the high-pitched screech of nails and bolts turning in slack joints, and there was the staccato clatter of metals and chains washing together in the water, and dull, ominous thumping sounds coming from inside the hull where things were breaking loose and floating around. And there were terrible smells. There was the smell of hot metal and smoldering oakum, the smells of spilled fuel and burned food, and passed back and forth among the men who clung like bugs to the boat's white sides and underbelly. There was the smell of fear. And after a short time, the screaming began. Men calling out each other's names, throwing names repeatedly into the darkness. There was a large contingency of Italian passengers, and apparently they were praying in unison, asking for help from the Blessed Virgin Mary. And miners were imploring their gods too, but differently, with oaths and curses. And there was absolute bedlam there in the darkness as the boat heaved and pitched and was washed about in the tremendous waves. And finally, after what seemed like a dreadfully long time, there was the voice of Captain Lean calling for order and asking for help with the lifeboats. 9 men drowned that night. 7 of them were simply washed away by the violence of the storm during the first 2 unsuccessful attempts to launch the lifeboats. And 2 other men, including the young fiddle player, Jim McNeil, were simply never seen again. And it was assumed that they were trapped below deck when the boat rolled over. And more men would have died that night, but the storm was finally subsiding. And eventually they got the last lifeboat launched properly, and 7 people made it to shore, to a beach south of Grey Creek. It took them a long time to get there because they were having to row and paddle with pieces of board torn off the wheelhouse wall because, of course, the oars had washed away. And it took most of the night for that little boat to go back to the wreck twice more to bring back all the survivors. And the people who did make it to shore, of course, built a huge big fire to stand around. And shortly after the last of the survivors had made it back to shore at a time when it was close to dawn breaking, the group was standing around and the moon had actually come up. And the men were standing around and they were kind of, at first they were almost roughhousing with each other a bit, we survived. That was a close call. But then the group grew quite sober and introspective. And it was during one of these very quiet moments when someone looked out and went, oh, look what I see. And everybody turned, and they could not believe their eyes. Because there, 600 or 700 yards offshore, was the wreck of the Ainsworth. She could be seen rising and falling on the rounded forms of the dying storm, and the boat was headed right toward the beach that they were standing on. And the irony of this wasn't lost on the dullest man among them. If they had just stayed with the boat, fewer men would have drowned. Because the city of Ainsworth didn't actually sink for 2 more days. But when she did, she went to a place so deep and dark, so icy cold, and so remote that she would not be seen again by human eyes for 99 years. And how did that all come about? Well, that's another story.